Uh, Chair, Mr. Speaker, I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to support this amazing bill by the great senator of Nairobi and also still my SG in the ODM party. Because the mischief that the senator of Nandi is trying to bring is that my SG now is the SG of the broad-based government. That one is now akin to interfering with my certificate in 2027. So I want to guarantee you that this is the SG of ODM, who is still the custodian of my ticket. But Mr. Speaker, on a more serious note, this amendment is a very serious amendment. Mr. Speaker, EPRA in the year 2022, just after COVID, I remember it was May, when EPRA released its daily systems, operations, and dispatch analysis report, which did indicate at that time, Mr. Speaker, that the Kenyan demand for electricity had just hit 2,051 megawatts. That, I think, is the highest the country had by that time. And remember, that was at a time that we were just coming from, we were just in a post-COVID era, immediately after the economic meltdown that was brought by COVID. But, Mr. Speaker, that demand, if you look at it against the national capacity for electricity, we had actually overshot our capacity at that time. Because even by 2018, Mr. Speaker, the capacity that we had in the national grid, Mr. Speaker, was 2,351. There is something that number showed us. And it's important because the country is gearing towards trying to get to a 2030 national grid of about 15,000 megawatts. And you find that it is only in Kenya that, number one, Mr. Speaker, the cost of production of electricity by independent power producers, Mr. Speaker, is very low. Yet, when it hits the national grid, we get the highest electricity tariffs that then affects our people. Number two, Mr. Speaker, the utilities that we have in our country at a national level are some of the most well-resourced utilities that cover their entire variable cost, yet they remain loss-making utilities, Mr. Speaker. Now, to add salt to injury, Mr. Speaker, the Kenyan taxpayer who ends up going to the market to get energy for whichever reason, whether it is commercial or domestic, Mr. Speaker, still faces the issue of low quality service, even when it comes to that. We sometimes get people with serious problems of specs of different meters that are not working, different meters are also not reflecting their payments. There's a lot of low quality service that we still see in the power consumption in this country, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, I cannot stress enough the importance of power in our country in terms of actually making sure that our national total productivity factor, in terms of the output that we get from every single citizen in this country, how important this is, Mr. Speaker. To give you perspective, Mr. Speaker, today a French kid consumes 50 times more electricity than a Kenyan kid. Mr. Speaker, a kid born in the United States consumes 70 times more electricity than a kid born in Kenya, Mr. Speaker. Yet, competitively, Mr. Speaker, across the globe, Kenya has placed itself at an edge of using proper clean energy to the extent that almost over 80% of our energy is from renewable and clean sources, Mr. Speaker. What is the problem? This is where I come back and laud my friend and my very good SG, Senator for Nairobi, for dissecting the root cause of this problem. And that root cause, Mr. Speaker, is lack of public accountability and governance in terms of the consumption, production and consumption of power and energy in our country, Mr. Speaker. To be very specific, Mr. Speaker, the transparency throughout the procurement process of power has been wanting seriously in Kenya. And this amendment, Mr. Speaker, seeks to address this core issue of that transparency and accountability. not only in the governance structure, but also in the entire procurement process, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I come from Migori County, where I happen to be very lucky to be born around Gogo Falls. And Gogo Falls is one of those Kenyan facilities that produces a lot of power, Mr. Speaker. But I can tell you that up to today, 95% of my village mate, where Gogo Power is based, have got no electricity in their homes. If you go to the other stretch, that is in Uriri constituency, Mr. Speaker, and if you go to the other stretch in Nyatike constituency, the penetration of power in Nyatike constituency, Mr. Speaker, is less than 23%. Yet Gogo Falls is found within the borders of these two amazing and very productive constituencies. That is Nyatike constituency and Uriri constituency. The pathetic nature of lack of consumption of power in my county, Mr. Speaker, spans all the way to places like Kuria West and Kuria East, Mr. Speaker. If today you go to Masangora, where people are very industrious and they're in the border of Kenya and Tanzania, where tourism could be cultivated properly when you think about the use of energy, to think about the entire security infrastructure of that county, Mr. Speaker. The amazing people of Kuria, despite their industriousness, still wallow in the miasma of having less than 25% of power penetration, Mr. Speaker. And this, I can narrate, goes all the way to places like Rongo, sub-county, to places like Awendo, where you'll find that an amazing industry called Awendo Soni, or the Southern Nyanza sugarcane industry, Mr. Speaker, is found. And yet the sugarcane growers and sugarcane cutters in those areas, Mr. Speaker, still depend sometimes to extreme end of using firewood to light their homes at night. And the question is not the question of capacity. The question here is the question of governance and transparency that can be able to make sure that the abundance that we have in this commodity called electricity can be able to percolate through every single home and all the industry that we have. So what does Senator Sifuna seek to do with this amazing bill? Which is why I want to urge the entire House to support this bill. The first thing, Mr. Speaker, we find that today Kenya Power has signed over 45 power purchase agreements. Yet if you look through the internet and through all government bodies, Mr. Speaker, the information to the public with regards to the details of those agreements are completely scanty. You can't find them. And why are these information pieces important for the public? They are important because, Mr. Speaker, you cannot have power purchase agreements without detailing the cost structure and the resulting prices of power as they should be. And this is at the core of what this bill seeks to address. Because when you can be able to allow the public interact with the cost structure in those agreements, then they can be able to further interdict and be able to give input on what kind of prices these contracts should then result in the cost of power in our country, Mr. Speaker. But more importantly, Mr. Speaker, even then, the moment these contracts are hidden to the public and the details of those contracts are hidden to the public, Mr. Speaker, there's something called cost competitiveness. We cannot have serious cost competitiveness in the entire market divide of power in this country. Why? Because every contract is individualized and is hidden from the proper market value that it should have, so that anybody can choose to make the cost of power anything they want, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, this amendment is the core of making sure that we're going to have proper price reduction in the power sector, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, alongside the issue of cost of power, Mr. Speaker, is the issue of power stability and power quality within our borders. Mr. Speaker, you have seen a number of times, even in Nairobi recently and across the country, when you will be hearing from social media that you are going to face power blackouts. It has been announced by whichever body that you're going to face power blackouts. Yet, you do not have power to control when you'll get that power back. You do not have power to control how you can be able to get your alternatives. You do not have power to control how this is going to affect the payments that you already made to the national power grid, Mr. Speaker. To the extent that we can be able to figure out the impact of this lack of transparency on power stability and power quality, Mr. Speaker, this is the bill that we need. This is the bill that, for the first time, will be able to ensure that that procurement process of people who cannot be able to allow power stability when they're bringing them to the national grid, Mr. Speaker, to be guaranteed. The bill will give us that, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, there's something close to my heart, and I've seen it through this bill and through the lenses of the presentation by Senator Sifuna, that this bill will help us procure and also cure is the issue of safeguarding our environmental and our social priorities, Mr. Speaker. If we are not careful, despite the fact that as a country we are priding ourselves that we are leading in terms of clean energy, Mr. Speaker, the interaction with that with our environmental safety and social safety, Mr. Speaker, cannot be guaranteed if you cannot be able to interrogate the procurement processes. What do I mean by this, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, we have seen a number of times when Kenya Power wants to look at things like metering processes. Because of that lack of transparency, you will find that the procurement officers will then keenly and carefully choose to actually ignore the specs that are required by standard of law, to the extent that in many cases, people end up going to bring specs that are defective, are of low quality, that then ensures that our people cannot be guaranteed in terms of their safety. In a number of places, you hear about KPLC not being able to meet its targets in neighborhoods such as slummy areas. Reason being, they had defective metering systems that people can bypass, that people can sometimes connect, and then before you realize, you are seeing a lot of fire hazards in different places. In Nairobi, Mr. Speaker, we constantly see a number of fire hazards that if you were to go down and interrogate where those fire hazards are coming from, Mr. Speaker, you'll find that it's because of defective metering and defective specs that have been put in a number of access points of electricity, Mr. Speaker. And this is putting our people in hazardous environment, is putting our people in very serious social problems, Mr. Speaker. Toy market recently lost property worth billions. That's where Sifuna comes from. I think 2 days ago, there was serious fire in Mukuru Kwajenga, Mr. Speaker. These places are facing these fires, and nobody ever explains the sources of this fire. But if you look at the kind of connections that we are having and connectivity that we are having, defective and default connections in our neighborhood, Mr. Speaker, occasioned by serious lack of transparency on the specs of meter systems and any other systems of connectivity that we need in our neighborhood, Mr. Speaker, you can cry over this country, Mr. Speaker. And therefore, it is extremely important that that entire process is completely unlocked. And this bill chooses to enable the country get to the bottom line of this problem, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, along this is the structure of taxation on electricity with regards to the cost structure that is given to independent power producers, Mr. Speaker. This one is a very serious part of transparency and governance, Mr. Speaker. How does the national government choose to tell us which part of the money that they collect from KPLC and any other national grid providers comprises the taxation element and which one comprises the competitive revenue or competitive profit for these companies, Mr. Speaker? Because we have seen a number of times when KPLC complains, it does complain in form of we are being overtaxed and therefore we want to increase tariffs to respond to that taxation. But how is that taxation connected to the cost structure of their purchasing agreements, their power purchasing agreements with other independent producers. Because, Mr. Speaker, you can't tell me that out of 1 shilling, the government chooses to arbitrarily take 57 cents in terms of taxes from KPLC, and KPLC must throw that taxation back to the consumer and doesn't connect it to the cost of purchase or cost of production, if we may use that language, from the independent power producers, Mr. Speaker. The only reason why KPLC can use that impunity on Kenyans is if there is no proper transparency in terms of the agreements that it has had with every single private developers and private producers who are adding to its national grid. That is the only explanation, Mr. Speaker. And that is also tied squarely to being able to disclose the number of loans that KPLC and all the national grid suppliers can be able to argue in terms of the pricing of electricity, Mr. Speaker. Because otherwise, KPLC will just tell you that we took a number of loans here and there, and those loans, we helped XYZ developments. We were developing this utility at X cost, which is also not given proper detail, but just basic. And then before you realize, the cost keep on skyrocketing, Mr. Speaker. So in conclusion, Mr. Speaker, I really want to laud and appreciate this bill that Senator Sifuna has brought into this house. And I hope that the senators in this house will see how important it is for us as a house to be able to build a functional element of the law that can be able to ensure that procurement processes of all power capacity is done through a very transparent process, which then in the end allows for a competitive, market-based, scientific production and consumption of power. And additionally, Mr. Speaker, this is the first bill, in my humble view, that will ensure that there is always public notice and public engagement on the intention to be able to sign contracts by independent power producers, and to be able to make sure that the public is always having a notice. I'm talking about the intention for power purchase agreements. Because without the public knowing about this intention, Mr. Speaker, that is how you end up in a situation where public is being invited on a conversation around a deal that has been done. Like the case for Adani, Mr. Speaker, despite the fact that the Minister for Energy or the CS for Energy currently has told us the capacity that Adani has, he's telling us the capacity that Adani has on the power production and consumption in this country at the age of Adani having been given the contract. So why is the public being invited to even give its views in the first place? If at the intentional moment, there was no deliberateness in terms of engaging the public. So this bill is going to ensure that when there is an intention to sign any power purchase agreement or any power deal with any kind of institutions within or without government in the corporate sector, Mr. Speaker, then the public is noticed on that intention. And therefore, the public can then go ahead and be able to contribute before an action is taken to give the deal to any of those private developers, Mr. Speaker. And lastly, Mr. Speaker, it is always important that when the public comes to engage in a public participation, it must have proper details in terms of information that informs robust contribution in that process, Mr. Speaker. This bill, as I finish, Mr. Speaker, gives the key and access for the public to be able to have details of contracts, so that when the public is engaging and making comment at any given period of intentionality, then it is giving comment based on data, based on science, and based on facts and figures on those power purchase agreements that are within their understanding.